Okay, fam, I'm back. And now we are going to, just as I promised, now we are going to break down these charges. We're going to break down the new charges, the upgraded charges against Derek Chauvin, and we're going to break down the charge of aiding and abetting that the other three officers got. And all three of them are in custody because, as you can see from the thumbnail, you see their mug shots. So all three of them are in custody. But like I said, before we go through the process of claiming that this is any kind of victory or anything like that, we need to understand exactly what the Attorney General Keith Ellison, exactly what he did, and exactly what's actually in these criminal complaints against these three. So first, I want to read just a little bit from this article in NBC News, NBCnews.com, and let's see what they're saying. Three more Minneapolis officers charged in George Floyd death. Derek Chauvin charges up elevated. The three former officers are charged with aiding and abetting murder. The fourth, who placed his knee on Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, 8 minutes and 46 seconds to be exact, now faces a second-degree murder charge. But is it the right second-degree murder charge? That's the question. This is by Daha Madani. Three more former Minneapolis police officers were charged Wednesday in the death of George Floyd, 5 days after charges were brought against a fourth officer who was seen in a video kneeling on Floyd's neck. The three officers, Thao, Thomas Lane, and J. Alexander Kueng, they say King, but it's Kueng, were charged with aiding and abetting murder, according to criminal complaints filed by the state of Minnesota. The murder charges against the fourth, Derek Chauvin, was also elevated to second-degree murder from third degree. An attorney for Kueng said in a statement that the former officer turned himself in at about 1:35 p.m. today, June 3rd. All four of the men face a maximum sentence of 40 years in prison, according to the criminal complaints. So we know that Chauvin has Tom Kelly. We know that Kueng has a lawyer. They haven't said his name yet, but we don't know yet whether Lane or Thao have retained attorneys. The Minnesota Fraternal Order of Police did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the elevated murder charges against Chauvin or the charges filed against the other three officers. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison asked the community for continued patience on Wednesday as his team of prosecutors investigate the case, noting that prosecution of police officers for such a charge is a difficult task. I feel a tremendous sense of weight. I feel that this is a very serious moment. I can tell you I feel no joy in this, but I do feel a tremendous sense of duty and responsibility. So exactly why he doesn't feel any sense of joy is beyond me. Why would you, as an attorney general, as a prosecutor, as a human being, as a black man, as a father, why would you not take some joy in the fact that now you can bring charges against four men who I think intentionally took the life of an individual who was handcuffed, bound, restrained, and laying flat on his stomach? But anyway, in this article, it says Pete Williams explains new charges against Minnesota officers. So let's hear a little bit of what he has to say.
As the world practices social distancing, it's easy to feel isolated.
It's important to stay mindful of our mental
You know, they got to have an ad on everything.
Spend time with family. These things may sound like common sense,
but reminding ourselves to stay present and connected.
Might just be the most helpful thing we can do.
You may be by yourself, but you're not alone. The more you know.
Yeah, that's what I say. But anyway, here we go.
Justice correspondent Pete Williams right now in our Washington newsroom. Pete, break these charges down for us, if you will.
Sure. First of all, this is a 40-year maximum under the second-degree murder charge. The one he had faced before third-degree murder was 25 years. There's one additional element in the criminal complaint. It says that at one point, Mr. Floyd, George Floyd, when he was on the ground, said, quote, "I'm about to die." So that's a new element in the charging document against Officer Chauvin. So the other three police officers, let's look at them individually. Thao is the one that...
But I want to say this, referring to what he just said. Yes, they did add that Floyd said, "I don't want to die," but what they refused to add, it wasn't in the first criminal complaint, and it is not in the revised criminal complaint, is when he said, "Don't kill me." And he says to the guy, I believe this was the guy that was originally sitting in the van with him in the passenger side, when he says to him, "Don't let them kill me." So it's almost like Floyd, it's almost like he knew that he was going to die. He knew they were going to kill him. Okay, so let's keep going.
That is standing off to the side in the video. Well, what the charges say is that he blocked the view of some of the bystanders and at one point restrained one bystander who was trying to get in and stop Officer Chauvin and get his knee off George Floyd's neck. Alexander King, J. Alexander King, he held the back of, you can see him in the middle there, he held George Floyd's back. And the third officer, Officer Thomas Kane, held his leg. So you see him on the right in that picture there. Now, they're all charged with aiding and abetting, but here is what's true under Minnesota law. If they are convicted, they face the same 40-year penalty that Chauvin would face. So basically, they're as criminally liable under this theory of the case as Officer Chauvin was. So it's the charge against Chauvin is basically what many states call felony murder. There's no intent, but it's committing a murder while attempting or committing a felony offense. So the theory of the case here is that Officer Chauvin, even though he may not have intended to kill George Floyd, did intend to use unreasonable force. And that's the felony murder key to the whole case.
Yeah, I think we for so many black families, there's no...
Okay, so that's what this gentleman had to say about these charges. The Attorney General insisted that public pressure was not a factor in his decision to elevate the murder charge or charge the other officers involved in the case. Ellison explains Wednesday after the charges were announced that first-degree murder would require proving premeditation, which the facts do not support at the moment. Instead, his team will assert that Chauvin committed a felony assault, which unintentionally resulted in Floyd's death, which fits the requirements for second-degree murder. While certainly progress on civil rights have been made over the course of American history, Walt said in a press conference on Wednesday he truly believes that this is the country's last shot to fix these systematic issues. Progress didn't keep George Floyd alive, and progress didn't keep these people out of the streets. They're not looking for just progress. They're looking for transformational change. Okay. So I'll have this article listed in the description box. And of course, y'all can go in the description box and you can read the whole article. But I just wanted you to hear this guy's breakdown of the charges, okay? Before we actually go into the complaints and start reading off the complaints and the charges. I wanted y'all to hear what he had to say, and I wanted you to hear his breakdown. So now let's get into the actual criminal complaints, okay? And we've already in a previous report, we already broke down the original criminal complaint against Derek Chauvin, and now we're just gonna read how it's been updated, upgraded, how it's been amended, that whole thing. So, state of Minnesota, county of Hennepin, district court, fourth judicial district, and then it has all the prosecutor file numbers and the court file numbers and all of this. State of Minnesota plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, and it's got his other information there. And now we have 3 counts instead of 2. So understand, they did not remove the 3rd-degree murder, perpetrating the imminently dangerous act and evincing deprived mind. Remember, we talked about that. We went over that. We defined deprived mind and all of that. They didn't remove that charge, and they didn't remove the 2nd-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk. They didn't remove that one either. So now we just have 3 counts. Now the first count has now become 2nd-degree murder, unintentional, while committing a felony. So they have removed the intent. Because remember, we read, and this is a different statute. This is not the statute that we read in the last report. The last report, the statute we read on second degree murder was, I think, 609.195, I believe it was. So let's go look at this statute that they're listing here and see what this says. Okay? Yeah, we're going to be here for a minute. 609.19.2. .19.2. Okay, let's see what we get. Okay. Murder in the 2nd degree. Okay, and they are using subdivision 1, 609.19.2, and 1 is in parentheses. Okay. Intentional murder, drive-by shootings. Whoever does either of the following is guilty of murder in the 2nd degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. 1. Cause the death of a human being with intent to affect the death of that person or another, but without premeditation. Okay, that's the one they didn't use. The one that they used was subdivision 2, unintentional murders. Whoever does either of the following is guilty of unintentional murder in the 2nd degree and may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. 1. Cause the death of a human being without intent to affect the death of any person while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense other than criminal sexual conduct in the 1st or 2nd degree with force or violence or a drive-by shooting. So instead of them using, well, it is actually the same one that we read the last time, but instead of them using subdivision 1, they use subdivision 2, unintentional murder. Even though they have proof, they have video evidence that this was intentional. And I still say that based on the fact that he kept his knee on this man's neck, the other one kept his knee on his back, the fact that they held this man down even after he has said over and over and over again, I can't breathe, don't kill me, I can't breathe. Even after he went silent, he was not responding. Even after his pulse was checked and they said that there was no pulse, they still held that position. For me, that shows intent. That shows intent. Especially when in the criminal complaint, it plainly says that these officers have been trained and have been taught that to apply this kind of restraint to a person in a prone position is inherently dangerous. Okay? But they are saying unintentional murder. They are saying that there's no intent. Now, some people will say that the reason why they're using unintentional is they stand a better chance of getting prosecution or getting a conviction if they use unintentional. And since it carries the same amount of time, because unintentional carries the same amount of time as intentional. Unintentional may be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. Well, intentional is the same thing. May be sentenced to imprisonment for not more than 40 years. So the punishment, the sentence is the same for intentional as it is unintentional. So it's very, very possible that they used unintentional here so that they wouldn't have to go through the process of trying to prove intent. Very possible. It's very possible that since it carries the same punishment, it carries the same amount of weight, it carries the same amount of sentence, they may have simply decided to go with unintentional, and that way they didn't even have to even be bothered with trying to prove that there was any intent on anybody's part, especially considering the fact that they have now charged the other three with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Because I guess in order to get them convicted of what they were charged with, just like you would have to prove intent for Chauvin, you would also have to prove intent for them. So even though we all know, based on what we've seen, we all know based on the video evidence that Chauvin intended to kill this man, it's very, very possible that the other three didn't actually intend to kill him. But since they had to be charged with aiding and abetting so that they could be just as criminally liable as Chauvin was, they had to charge Chauvin with the same thing that they could convict the others on. So that's the reason why I believe they chose unintentional murder. Okay? So let's keep going. So he's charged with, his first count is a second-degree murder, unintentional, while committing a felony. The felony that he committed, which would make it felony murder, the felony that he committed, it will be the same that all four of them committed, and that's a felony of assault, criminal felony assault. And what they're saying is they committed this murder, no matter how unintentional it may have been, they committed this murder while they were in the process of committing the felony of assaulting George Floyd. Okay? It's similar to the charges that the McMichaels got in the Ahmaud Arbery case. Felony murder. And the reason why they got felony murder charges is because whether they intended to kill him or not, they killed him, they murdered him, he died in the course of them committing the felony of aggravated assault. Okay? So, this is how it reads. Charge description: that on or about May 25th, 2020 in Hennepin County, Minnesota, Derek Michael Chauvin caused the death of a human being, George Floyd, without intent to affect the death of any person while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense other than criminal sexual assault. In the first, now, and they're saying that this felony that he was committing or attempting to commit was not criminal sexual assault, but it was in either the first degree or second degree by force or violence or drive-by shooting, mainly assault in the third degree. And then, of course, the second count again is third-degree murder. And the second account, and the third account is second-degree manslaughter. So they just added another account. They added this second-degree murder account to Chauvin. right? Okay, now let's go down here and let's see what they did with the rest of and first let's read how they changed the statement of probable cause, because they changed some things. So I'm just going to read it. And you can tell it was typed out so fast that there are typos and there's spaces missing and all of this, because this thing was typed out so fast. On May 25th, 2020, someone called 911 and reported that a man bought merchandise from Cup Foods at 3759 Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, Hennepin County, Minnesota, with a counterfeit $20 bill. At 8:08 p.m., Minneapolis Police Department officers Thomas Lang and J.A. Kueng arrived with their body-worn cameras activated and running. The officers learned from store personnel that the man who passed the counterfeit $20 bill was parked in a car around the corner from the store on 38th Street. BWC, that's the body cam, video obtained by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension shows that the officers approached the car, Lane on the driver's side and Kueng on the passenger side. 3 people were in the car. George Floyd was in the driver's seat. A known adult male was in the passenger seat, and a known adult female was sitting in the back seat. As Officer Lane began speaking with Mr. Floyd, he pulled his gun out and pointed it at Mr. Floyd's open window and directed Mr. Floyd to show his hands. When Mr. Floyd put his hands on the steering wheel, Lane put his gun back in his holster. Now, all of this is pretty much the same thing that we read in the first complaint. When Officer Kueng was speaking with the front seat passenger, Officer Lane ordered Mr. Floyd out of the car, put his hands on Mr. Floyd, pulled him out of the car. Officer Lane handcuffed Mr. Floyd. Once handcuffed, Mr. Floyd walked with Officer Lane to the sidewalk and sat on the ground at Officer Lane's direction. When Mr. Floyd sat down, he said, "Thank you, man," and was calm. So see, now they're taking out all of this bullshit talking about he resisted arrest and he physically resisted the officer, because remember, that was in their original statement. That was in their original report, is that he physically resisted officers. So now and some of that was in the original criminal complaint. Now they have removed that and showed how calm he was, to the point where he even said, "Thank you, man," to Officer Lane and all of this. In a conversation that lasted just under 2 minutes, Officer Lane asked Mr. Floyd for his name and identification. Officer Lane asked Mr. Floyd if he was on anything and noted there was foam at the edges of his mouth. Officer Lane explained that he was arresting Mr. Floyd for passing counterfeit currency. At 8:14 p.m., Officer Kueng and Lane stood Mr. Floyd up and attempted to walk Mr. Floyd to their squad car. They didn't attempt, they walked him over there. And you can see them walking him over there in the footage that we've been able to see. As the officers tried to put Mr. Floyd in their squad car, Mr. Floyd stiffened up and fell to the ground. Mr. Floyd told the officers that he was not resisting, but he did not want to get in the back seat and was claustrophobic. So again, we don't have somebody that's resisting. He actually tells the officers that he's not resisting, but he didn't want to get in the back seat because he was claustrophobic. MPD officers Derek Chauvin and Thao then arrived in a separate squad car. The officers made several attempts to get Mr. Floyd in the back seat of their squad car by pushing him in from the driver's side. So you have Floyd and all 4 officers on the driver's side. This is the side that's facing the sidewalk, the side that's facing that storefront. As the officers were trying to force Mr. Floyd in the back seat, Mr. Floyd repeatedly said that he could not breathe. Mr. Floyd did not voluntarily sit in the back seat, and the officers physically struggled to try to get him in the back seat. The defendant, and right here, this is a whole run-along sentence. They ain't put no spaces in this whatsoever. That lets you know how quickly this was typed out. It was typed out so quick, so they didn't even have time to go through the process of having somebody come in and edit this stuff. This whole sentence is one run-along sentence. There are no spaces in it whatsoever. And you'll see that when you look at the document yourself, because of course I'll have the link to this in the description box. The defendant went to the passenger side and tried to get Mr. Floyd into the car from that side, and Lane and Kueng assisted. So by now, you got those three dealing with Floyd. You got Thao, or Thao, or whatever they call him, over here. Now he's going to regulate the crowd. You understand what I'm saying? Now he's going to do crowd control. Now, here we go again. The defendant pulled Mr. Floyd out of the passenger side of the squad car at 8:19:38 p.m. They couldn't take that out, and the reason why they couldn't take it out is because you can see it on body cam. So they couldn't take it out. So again, the question remains: why, if the three of you have struggled this much to get this man into this squad car, why would you then pull him out on the passenger side? Because remember, all of this trying to get him in started on the driver's side. Chauvin goes over to the passenger side and reaches in, and they decide they're going to try to pull him in that way. Then they say that at 8:19:38, Chauvin pulls him out of the passenger side of the squad car. And Mr. Floyd went to the ground face down, still handcuffed. Kueng held Mr. Floyd's back, and Lane held his legs. The defendant placed his left knee in the area of Mr. Floyd's head and neck. Mr. Floyd said, "I can't breathe," multiple times, and said, "Mama," and "please" as well. At one point, Mr. Floyd said, "I'm about to die." The defendant and the other two officers stayed in their positions. So see, they added this, "I'm about to die," but they didn't add when he says, "Don't kill me. Don't let them kill me." Because he's clearly heard saying that when he's face down with knees and everything all on his neck and his back, and he being forcibly held down and all of this. He clearly says, "Don't let them kill me. Man, they gonna kill me." That's what he says, okay? One of the officers said, "You are talking fine," to Mr. Floyd as he continued to move back and forth. Lane asked, "Should we roll him on his side?" And the defendant said, "No, stay put right where we got him." Officer Lane said, "I am worried about excited delirium or whatever." The defendant said, "That's why we have him on his stomach." The defendant and Kueng held Mr. Floyd's right hand up. None of the three officers moved from their positions. While Mr. Floyd showed slight movements, his movements and sounds decreased until at 8:24:24, Mr. Floyd stopped moving. Pay very close attention to that, because later on you're going to hear what that meant. You're going to hear from a doctor, from a medical doctor, you're going to hear what that meant when he stopped moving, when he became completely unresponsive. At 8:25:31, the video appears to show Mr. Floyd ceasing to breathe or speak. Lane says again, "Want to roll him on his side." Kueng checked Mr. Floyd's right wrist for a pulse and said, "I couldn't find one." None of the officers moved from their positions. So again, at 8:25, even after pulse has been checked and no pulse can be found, even after this man has stopped moving, and even after it appears that he has ceased to breathe, they still hold their positions. At 8:27:24, the defendant removed his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck. An ambulance, and if you look at this real close, these folks that come up in this so-called ambulance are not at all dressed like EMT workers. They're not dressed like EMS. They're not dressed like paramedics. They have no equipment. They tried no CPR or anything on this man right there at the scene. These look like police officers dressed in different uniforms. They get him up and they just put him on the gurney and just put him in there, and they're gone. Now they claim, this is the claim, is that EMS paramedics tried to work on him in the back of the ambulance. They tried to do CPR. They tried to do the shock thing and all of that kind of stuff, but to no avail. So by the time he got to the hospital, he was pronounced dead. But if you go back and look at that video shows that These folks were not dressed like I said. They were not dressed like paramedics. You understand what I'm saying? They had no equipment. They didn't try any CPR or anything right there on site. Nothing. And there was another one of my subscribers, and her name fails me right now, but they also, a couple of people also bring up the fact that if you look at Chauvin's badge, it was just all crooked. And that's supposed to be some kind of violation of protocol or policy or whatever, as far as how their uniforms have to be and all of that. But anyway, let's keep moving. At 8:27:27, the defendant removed his knee from Mr. Floyd's neck. An ambulance and emergency medical personnel arrived. The officers placed Mr. Floyd on a gurney, and the ambulance left the scene. Mr. Floyd was pronounced dead at Hennepin County Medical Center. And again, nowhere in this timeline do they tell us when this ambulance, when emergency services were called, and who they were called by. Nowhere in this timeline. Now, they give us all of this specific timeline in seconds, almost down to the moment that this man died. But nowhere in here do they give us any time of when any one of these officers called an ambulance, called for emergency services. They don't give us a time for that. And that's very important. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner, ME, conducted Mr. Floyd's autopsy on May 26, 2020. While the ME did not observe physical findings supportive of mechanical asphyxia, the ME opinions that Mr. Floyd died from coronary pulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement officers. And a coronary pulmonary arrest just simply means that the heart stopped. The heart stopped pumping. His heart stopped. Okay? The autopsy revealed that Mr. Floyd had arteriosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, and toxicology testing revealed the presence of fentanyl and evidence of recent methamphetamine use. Now, like I said, later on in this video, you will hear a medical doctor who's trained in all of this stuff. You will hear him talk about some of this, and he will explain some of this, okay? The ME opinion that the effects of the officer's restraint on Mr. Floyd, his underlying health conditions, and the presence of the drugs contributed to his death. The ME listed the cause of death as cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compressions, and concluded the manner of death was homicide. Okay, so if you just think about that, now I want you to just think about that. He says that the death was homicide, which means this man was killed, which means this man was murdered. That's what homicide is, which means this man was murdered. Okay, if this man was murdered, all this other stuff up here that you're talking about, all of this so-called heart disease and toxicology and all of that kind of stuff, all of that really doesn't matter if at the end of the day, the manner of death was homicide. Somebody killed him. And it was not heart disease. It was not maybe the presence of drugs or none of that is what killed him. What killed him was homicide. He was murdered. Okay? Now just listen. The defendant and officers Lang and Kueng subdued Mr. Floyd prone to the ground in this manner for nearly 9 minutes. Remember, 8 minutes, 46 seconds. During this time, Mr. Floyd repeatedly stated he could not breathe, and his physical condition continued to deteriorate such that force was no longer necessary to control him. Force was never necessary to control him because the man was handcuffed and subdued the whole time. He was handcuffed and surrounded by 4 police officers. He was the one that went to the ground. And the complaint says that. The complaint does not say that they forced him to the ground so that they could subdue him or whatever. The complaint says that the man pulled him out of the passenger seat, out of the passenger side of the squad car, and he immediately went to the ground. The defendant had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 64 seconds in total. 2 minutes and 53 seconds of this was after Mr. Floyd was non-responsive. Police are trained that this type of restraint with a subject in a prone position is inherently dangerous. So again, the intent is there. If you've been trained that this position, that restraining somebody this way in this position is inherently dangerous, but you do it anyway, and then you do it for this length of time, shows intent. Officer Chauvin's restraint of Mr. Floyd in this manner for a prolonged period was a substantial causal factor in Mr. Floyd losing consciousness, constituting substantial bodily harm, and Mr. Floyd's death as well. Defendant is in custody. Okay, now that's Chauvin. And then, you go through all the different other pieces of paperwork that they have, the summons, the warrant, all of that kind of stuff. Then his fact sheet. And then the statute and offense grid, the charge, the date, the statute number and description, murder second degree without intent, murder third degree, perpetrating imminently dangerous act and evincing deprived mind, and manslaughter second degree, culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk. So those are the 3 charges against him. Those are the 3 felony charges against him. Now we want to go to Thao. And he has 2 charges against him. Count 1, aiding and abetting second degree murder, unintentional while committing a felony. It too holds a maximum sentence of imprisonment of not more than 40 years. This is the description of the charge. That on or about May 25th, 2020 in Hennepin County, Minnesota, Thao intentionally aided, advised, hired, counseled, or conspired with, or otherwise procured the other to commit the crime, namely causing the death of a human being, George Floyd, without intent to affect the death of any person while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense other than sexual conduct, or criminal sexual conduct in the first or second degree with force or violence, or a drive-by shooting, namely assault in the third degree. So the description of his crime is close to the description of Chauvin's crime, in that he aided and abetted, intentionally aided, advised, hired, counseled, conspired with, and all of that. All right, count 2, aided and abetting second degree manslaughter, culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk. This one carries an imprisonment of no more than 10 years or a payment of a fine of not more than $20,000 or both. That on or about May 25th, 2020 in Hennepin County, Thao intentionally aided, advised, hired, counseled, or conspired with, or otherwise procured the other to commit the crime, namely caused the death of another, George Floyd, by his culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, and consciously took the chances of causing death or great bodily harm to another, George Floyd. Okay, now let's read his statement of fact. Now, everything is the same in this statement of fact. Now, everything is the same until you get down to about, let's see which paragraph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. When you get down to about the 10th paragraph, it says everything else is the same until you get about to here. The defendant initially obtained a hobble restraint. Let's go over here and find out what a hobble restraint is. Okay, that's that harness thing. Yeah, that's that thing that's like a belt, that harness thing. That's what a hobble restraint is. All right. The defendant initially obtained a hobble restraint from the squad car to restrain Mr. Floyd in that manner, but the officers decided not to use it and maintained their positions. Right? Okay, now by this time, their positions are, you got Chauvin on his neck, you got Kueng on his back, and you got Lane holding his legs. Now, Thao goes to get a hobble restraint, which would have at least relieved the pressure on his back and his neck. But the officers chose not to use that and maintained the positions that they had. And these folks don't see intent. When there are all of these other options, and even somebody is presenting you with another option and you won't use it. During this time, the defendant looked directly at how Chauvin was restraining Mr. Floyd, with Chauvin's knee on Mr. Floyd's neck area, and observed that the three officers had Mr. Floyd subdued in this manner. The defendant then became concerned about a number of citizens who had gathered and were watching the officers subdue Mr. Floyd, and potential traffic concerns. And so the defendant stood between, this is Thao. So the defendant stood between those citizens and the three officers restraining Mr. Floyd. When one citizen stepped off the curb, imploring Chauvin to get off of Mr. Floyd's neck, defendant put his hands on the citizen to keep him back. Okay, and then from that point, it reads exactly like Chauvin's complaint. It changes right down here a little bit in this last paragraph. Officer Chauvin's restraint of Mr. Floyd in this manner for a prolonged period well, no, it didn't change. It didn't change. It's the same thing. But it didn't say that defendant was in custody, because at that time they still hadn't picked these guys up. These guys were not in custody, so that's the reason why at the end it doesn't say defendant is in custody like it did in Chauvin's complaint. Okay, let's go on. Now here are statute and offense grid for Thao. His first charge, of course, is murder, second degree without intent while committing a felony. The modifier is 609.05.1, liability for crimes of another, intentional. So, which means the aiding and abetting of the crime was intentional, right? Now, the crime, because they are also being charged with murder in the second degree, right? The modifier or the underlining charge is the aiding and abetting. And the aiding and abetting, which gives them liability for the exact same crime as Chauvin, the liability is intentional. And that offense doesn't have a level. And the same thing with manslaughter. He's also charged with manslaughter, second degree, culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk. And again, the modifier, which is intentional, and that is the aiding and abetting. Okay. So that's Thao. Okay, now we're going to get to Thomas Kernan Lane, right? Okay, he's been charged with the exact same thing, aiding and abetting, second degree murder, unintentional while committing a felony, and aiding and abetting, second degree manslaughter, culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk, and the descriptions of his charges are exactly the same as Thao. Probable cause, let's see where it changes. because it's exactly the same. Officer Chauvin, the defendant, which is Thomas Lane, and Officer Kueng subdued Mr. Floyd prone to the ground in this manner for nearly 9 minutes. During this time, Mr. Floyd repeatedly stated he could not breathe, and his physical condition continued to deteriorate, such that force was no longer necessary to control him. So that complaint pretty much reads the same as Thomas Taylor's. And again, his does not say defendant is in custody, because at that time they had not arrested these men. They had put out the arrest warrants, but they had not actually physically detained them. And his statute and offense grid is exactly the same as Tao's. Now let's go on to J. Alexander Kueng. Same charges: abetting and aiding and abetting second-degree murder, unintentional, while committing a felony, with the same description. Count 2, aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence creating unreasonable risk. Same description. Now let's see if the statement of probable cause reads any different from for this guy. We got it again. Officer Chauvin went to the passenger side and tried to get Mr. Floyd into the car from that side, and Lane and the defendant, Kueng here, assisted. Officer Chauvin pulled Mr. Floyd out of the passenger side of the squad car at 8:19:38 p.m. and Mr. Floyd went to the ground face down, still handcuffed. So somebody is going to have to answer the question, why? If you went through all of this trouble to get the man in the squad car, why would you then turn around and pull him back out? Okay, everything is still the same. Now, this is the guy that checked his pulse. The defendant checked Mr. Floyd's right wrist for a pulse and said, I couldn't find one. None of the officers moved from their positions. So again, even after checking for a pulse, the man has stopped moving. You know what I'm saying? The man is now, it now appears that this man has stopped breathing and all of this. You know, you got Lane talking about, okay, again, do we want to roll him over on his side? So this means the second time that Lane has said that, now you got Kueng checking the pulse and saying that there is none, but yet they still maintain their positions, which is Chauvin with his knee in his neck. I think it's Lane with the knee in the back, and Kueng holding his legs, or it might have been the other way. It's hard to keep up. But okay, everything else is still, yeah. After that, it's all still the same. So the last three, those three, Thao, Lane, and Kueng, their complaints pretty much read exactly the same. And at the end of these complaints, it doesn't say the defendant is in custody like it did with Chauvin, because these guys hadn't been arrested and detained and brought in custody yet. And of course, his statute and offense grid reads the same as the other three. Okay, so those are the 4 complaints. Those are the 4 complaints. That's how it's broken down. The main thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is that yes, the charge was upgraded to second degree, but they're still saying it's unintentional. Again, maybe the reason why they're going with unintentional is because even with unintentional, it carries the exact same prison sentence, the exact same punishment. So if they use unintentional, then once they get to court and get to try this case, then they don't have to go through the process of trying to prove that any of them acted with intent. So that may have been the safest route for them to take, even though for us on the outside looking in, intent is obvious. Intent is clear. Okay. Again, they still in these complaints and in this timeline, because they give us a timeline in these criminal complaints. In this timeline, they don't give us any time when this emergency or when the ambulance or whatever was called and who did the calling, which officer called for backup or which officer called for emergency services or whatever. We don't get that. So did they do that? And at what point did they do that? Because I mean, the way EMT just rolled in, like they just knew exactly what time they needed to be there, you know, that's kind of suspicious. That's suspect. Especially when you got these so-called paramedics coming out. They're not dressed as EMT. You understand what I'm saying? They don't have any equipment. They didn't try any kind of efforts to revive him or to bring him around. Nobody checked. Well, I think it's one guy you can see checking for a pulse. But they didn't try any. They had no equipment with them or anything. They checked for a pulse, put him on the gurney, put him in the back of the ambulance, and drove off. And that's real suspect, especially considering the fact that we have nothing in these complaints, no time when they specify that anybody called an ambulance. Okay? But it's like the ambulance, it's like the ambulance just knew exactly the moment when to pull up. And as soon as the ambulance pulled up, you know what I'm saying, without any hesitation or whatever, they all moved off of this man. Like almost in synchronization, they all moved off of this man as soon as the ambulance pulled up. And by this time, of course, they knew he was dead. Okay? So, like I said, this will be in the description box so that you can go through it and you can read it for yourself. But there's one more thing that I want y'all to hear. And this is very, very important because as we know, we have a second autopsy. And that was done by an independent medical examiner. This guy from New York, Michael Batten. And he's saying that, let's see if I still got what he said in my notes. Hold on a minute. Yeah, here it is. And he's saying an independent autopsy ordered by George Floyd's family found his death was a homicide caused by asphyxia due to neck and back compressions that led to a lack of blood flow to the brain.
The autopsy shows that Mr. Floyd had no underlying medical problem that caused or contributed to his death. This is confirmed by information provided to Dr. Wilson and myself from the family. He was in good health. The compressive pressure of the neck and back are not seen at autopsy because the pressure has been released by the time the body comes to the medical examiner's office. It can only be seen, serious compressive pressure on the neck and back can only be seen while the pressure is being applied, or when, as in this instance, it is captured on video.
So basically what he's saying is, had we not had that video, then the pressure wouldn't have been seen because the pressure has been removed by that time. So the pressure wouldn't have been seen, so it might have been harder to actually come up with the cause of his death. But because of that video, you can see the pressure being applied to the back of his neck, and you can see the pressure being applied to his back. So that gives you other things to look for, okay? That gives you the information that you need to look for, right? Now, we're not going to keep on with that. I'm just going to read what else he said. The independent examiner found that weight on Floyd's back, the handcuffs, and the positioning were contributory factors because they impaired the ability of Floyd's diaphragm to function. Okay? So that's what I wanted you to hear. And again, I'll have this down in the description box too, so you can go back and refer to it after you listen to what you're about to hear now. Now this is coming from Dr. Michael Hansen. And Dr. Michael Hansen, well, I'm gonna let him give you all of his credentials as far as being a doctor is concerned. And this video is actually 19 minutes and 18 seconds long. So I'm not going to play the whole entire video. I'm just going to play some parts so that you can kind of get a gist of what he's saying. And then I'll leave the link in the description box so you can go back and listen to his complete medical explanation of what the autopsies found. So listen up.
We've all seen the video by now. It's obvious these former police officers killed George Floyd. The Hennepin County medical examiner and the medical examiner hired by the family of George Floyd have concluded that his death was a homicide, but their opinion differs on the cause of death. But if both of them declared that his death was a homicide, does the cause of death really matter? Yes, because the trial is going to involve all of these former police officers, and their defense will likely hinge on this specific topic. Now, I want justice for George Floyd, and that's why I'm making this video, because the medical explanation for the cause of his death is not a simple explanation. It's actually more complicated than most people think. So I'm going to break down from a medical standpoint what led to his death. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Mike Hansen. I'm board certified in 3 specialties: internal medicine, pulmonary disease, and critical care medicine. As a pulmonologist, part of my job is to figure out why people can't breathe. As an intensive care doctor, part of my job is to care for people who are on the brink of death, like when someone can't breathe. Sometimes people die in the intensive care unit, and part of my job entails pronouncing death and then completing a death certificate form where I have to put down what caused the death. And this is more of a gray area than most people realize, because the cause of death is just about always multifactorial, meaning there are actually lots of causes that either directly or indirectly lead to death. So I'm going to ignore the topic of brain death because that's a separate discussion by itself and not really pertinent to this video. For example is, let's say, when someone with cancer is getting chemotherapy and their immune system is severely weakened, meaning it's suppressed because of that chemotherapy. Well, if they get a bacterial infection that spreads throughout their entire body, meaning sepsis, they then go into septic shock and multi-organ failure and then cardiopulmonary arrest. Well, what's the cause of death in that scenario? Well, it's really all of the above. They're all interconnected and they all play a part in that. So not always, but usually the cause of death is multifactorial. Now, before I get to what asphyxia means, we need to understand This is a Greek term that literally translates to stopping of the pulse. Carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of your body, needs to be removed from the body, which happens when you exhale. The blood that is delivered from the body and back to the lungs contains a lot of carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide then diffuses from the red blood cells to the alveoli, and then you exhale out that carbon dioxide. So in the alveoli, oxygen is going into the blood, and carbon dioxide is leaving the blood. So now that we understand some basic human anatomy and physiology, let's turn to the medical term asphyxia. This is a Greek term that literally translates to stopping of the pulse. It's a generic term that refers to a condition in which there's inadequate delivery of oxygen to the body's tissues, often accompanied by a retention of carbon dioxide. There are hundreds of different reasons why this can happen. Usually when a medical examiner is using the word asphyxia, they're referring to airway compromise or compromise of blood flow to the brain, such as with mechanical asphyxia. Positional asphyxia is caused by the position of the body or part of the body, leading to airway restriction, vascular compromise, or breathing fatigue. This can occur if someone is suspended upside down for a prolonged amount of time. When someone is handcuffed and in prone position, and they have a weight on their back, and if it's severe enough to the point where they can't breathe, this would be a combination of compression and positional asphyxia. Prolonged, continuous application, typically minutes, of extreme pressure on the thorax, such as with the body weight of several officers, is capable of causing death. This is important because this contributed to the death of George Floyd. It wasn't just the knee to the neck, but now sclerosis. And still, there are other more indirect factors as well, such as underlying heart disease, lung disease, and drug use. Another important question is, what are the autopsy findings in someone who dies of asphyxia? Well, I'll start out by saying there are no pathognomonic findings for asphyxia. By that I mean there aren't specific findings that only occur with asphyxia, and sometimes there are no findings at all with asphyxia. However, there are findings that are characteristic of different forms of asphyxia. The nature and extent of these findings depend on the kind of asphyxia. For example, in hanging and strangulation cases, there can be facial swelling, petechial hemorrhages in the face, eyes, and gums, which usually happens when arterial blood flow in the carotid arteries persists after jugular venous flow has stopped. Sometimes there can be skin markings such as scratches from nails or ligature marks. You can also have internal neck structure damage like hyoid bone and laryngeal fractures. There have been experimental studies and videotaped events of hanging and strangulation that show rapid loss of consciousness after compression of the neck, typically within 20 seconds. In these instances, the last breath occurs no later than 2 minutes. But this is for hanging cases, which is not what happened to George Floyd. Unlike a hanging, where lack of circulation to the brain is the primary cause of death, when someone dies of asphyxia primarily because they can't breathe, meaning respiratory rest, they typically lose a pulse around the same time of when they stop breathing. And looking at the George Floyd video...
Now, did you hear what he said? They typically lose their pulse around about the same time that they stop breathing.
Brain is the primary cause of death. When someone dies of asphyxia primarily because they can't breathe, meaning respiratory rest, they typically lose a pulse around the same time of when they stop breathing. And looking at the George Floyd video, he was unconscious for more than 2 minutes with the knee still on his neck. There's no doubt that during this time, he took his last breath right around the same time that he lost his pulse. By the time...
Now, let's go back to the complaints. And in that probable cause section, it clearly states that at 8:25:31, the video appears to show Mr. Floyd ceasing to breathe or speak. At this time, Lane said, "Want to roll him on his side." This is when Kueng checked Mr. Floyd's right wrist for a pulse and said, "I couldn't find one." So he died right there on the scene. Based on what this medical doctor is telling us, that according to his type of asphyxiation, his pulse would have stopped right around the same time that he took his last breath. Okay? Let's go back to the doctor.
The EMS guy checks his pulse. I highly doubt he actually felt a pulse, because it was more than 2 minutes after George lost consciousness. It was obvious that when they moved George onto the stretcher, he was completely limp because he was dead. And it wasn't until much later did they start CPR in the ambulance. Now let's get to what the medical examiners had to say about this case. There was the Hennepin County medical examiner, and then there was the independent medical examiner, Dr. Michael Baden. The independent autopsy says Floyd died of, quote, asphyxiation from sustained pressure when his back and neck were compressed, with the neck pressure cutting off blood flow to his brain. I agree with that assessment. That's what happened. I would also add that partial compression of the trachea causing airway compromise was also possible, but there's no way to prove or disprove that because you don't know how much pressure was being applied to that trachea. We know that because George was talking at least some of the time, you can conclude that he did not have total tracheal occlusion for the entire duration of the knee being on the neck. But the weight on his back made the work of breathing much harder for his diaphragm to contract, and the neck pressure at the very least meant less oxygen was being delivered to his brain, and less carbon dioxide could be removed from his brain. After a while, no way to prove or disprove that because the entire duration of the knee being on the neck.
Let's listen
but
to this.
The weight on his back made the work of breathing much harder for his diaphragm to contract.
Okay, the weight of the back of the pressure on his back made it much harder for his diaphragm to do the job that it was supposed to do, so it can expand and contract and all of this kind of stuff like it was supposed to. Well, if we go back to what Dr. Michael Baden said in his autopsy, let's get back to that. What Dr. Baden said, he said the same thing. The independent examiner found that weight on Mr. Floyd's back, the handcuffs, and the positioning that he was in were contributory factors because they impaired.
Autopsy shows
Hold on.
That Mr. Floyd had no underlying.
Because they impaired the ability of Floyd's diaphragm to function. So it's right there in line with what we have this doctor telling us. Okay, let's go back to Doc.
The neck pressure at the very least meant less oxygen was being delivered to his brain, and less carbon dioxide could be removed from his brain. After a while, the diaphragm becomes fatigued and no longer has the strength to contract, which means the lungs can't get oxygen into the blood and can't get carbon dioxide out of the blood. And whatever oxygen was in his blood, well, less of it was being delivered to his brain because of that pressure on the neck. And all of this caused him to lose consciousness. And probably within seconds, he lost a pulse. And despite losing consciousness, and despite losing a pulse, they continued to apply pressure on the neck and their weight on his back as well. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office said that the cause of death is, quote, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, end quote. This statement doesn't really make sense to me. It seems like it's trying to say that police restraint and neck compression caused cardiac arrest, which is like what we talked about, asphyxia, although they didn't use the word asphyxia, and it did not mention the weight that was being put on his back. But the Hennepin County release also says heart disease was an issue. The independent examiner didn't find that. The county said that fentanyl and methamphetamine were among significant conditions, but its report didn't say how much of either drug was in his system or how that may have contributed. So here's the thing. Let's say for a second, at least hypothetically speaking, he had underlying heart disease and he had fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. So what? Could those have indirectly contributed to his death? Sure, but that's not the direct cause of his death. A better way to describe it would be to say they might have hastened his death had he not had heart disease or those drugs in his system. But either way, that's not what killed him. The officers had their weight on his back and pressure on his neck, for a total of 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and for 2 minutes and 53 seconds after he lost consciousness. So Dr. Michael Baden got it right. But when he said, quote, police have this false impression that if you can...
So this, of course, the doctor's video, of course, will be in the description box as well. And you can go and you can look at his whole video. Like I said, it's 19 minutes, 18 seconds. You can look at his whole video because the first few minutes, he breaks down certain processes inside the body. As far as blood flow, as far as the work of arteries, as far as the work of the diaphragm, as far as the difference between what actually causes a death and those other things that may indirectly or directly contribute to the cause of death. He goes into all of that in the first part of the video. So, you know, if you want to look at that, it's very, very interesting to look at, and he really, really breaks it down. But I just wanted to give y'all those little spurts from him because he is a medical doctor, because he is a pulmonary specialist, because he is a critical care doctor, and he knows what he's talking about. So that's the reason why I wanted you to hear what he had to say, and I wanted you to hear how medically what he's saying corroborates what the independent medical examiner is saying about the cause of death. And again, the complaints talk about this pressure from this officer being on his back, as well as the pressure that's being applied to his neck. So the criminal complaints talk about that, but the medical examiner never mentions that. He never mentions the pressure to the back. He never mentions the pressure to the back that caused all the trouble with the diaphragm and caused the diaphragm not to be able to contract and function the way that it was supposed to function, so that you know, he could at least try to get a little bit of air. And because of that pressure on his back, it was impairing, and you heard what the doctor said. It exhausted the diaphragm. The diaphragm just got exhausted from trying to do its job and could no longer do its job. So you got the knee on the neck, which was stopping the flow of blood to the brain, and you've got the knee on the back, which was impeding the diaphragm's ability to work. And all of this together is what caused this man's death. Didn't have anything to do with whether or not he had pre-existing conditions. Didn't have anything to do with whether or not he had drugs in his system. Didn't have anything to do with that. Had they not had that pressure on his back and that knee in his neck, he'd still be alive. Okay? So, that's what I wanted to give y'all. Again, I'll even put some information in the description box about this hobble restraint that they say that Thao went and got this hobble restraint, which probably would have saved the man's life if they had used the hobble restraint and got all of that pressure off of him so that he could breathe and so that blood could flow to his brain like it was supposed to. He'd probably still be alive. But they chose not to use the hobble restraint, and they chose to keep their position, which was all of this pressure on his body in these pivotal points that would cause loss of life. Okay? So that's what I wanted to bring y'all. I wanted to break down these charges again. And like I said, as far as I'm concerned, even in the criminal complaints, you clearly see intent. In the video, you clearly see intent. At some point, somebody's going to have to explain why Chauvin pulled the man back out of the squad car after they went through all the trouble of getting him in there. At some point, somebody's going to have to say when EMS was called, when emergency services were called. Because it's not listed in the timeline in any of these criminal complaints. So there are still a whole lot of questions that need to be answered. And like I said, it's clear to us out here on the outside looking at that video. It's clear. The intent is clear. At least on the part of Chauvin, the intent is clear. But again, like I said, maybe the reason why Mike Freeman and AG, the Attorney General, Mike Ellis, maybe Keith Ellis, maybe the reason why they went with this unintentional charge is because, like I said, for one, it carries the same punishment, the same amount of time, the same possible sentence. And in order for you to charge the other three with aiding and abetting, they had to be charged with a crime that didn't show intent. Because even though you may be able to prove that Chauvin had intent, you might not be able to prove that the other three had intent. So maybe that's the reason why they had to go with unintentional second-degree murder. But again, just wanted to break it down to you. Just wanted to bring you what the doctor had to say. Just wanted to let you know what's going on and how this stands right now. Whether or not they'll upgrade charges again, we don't know. Ellis said that it may, as you heard in the previous video when we talked about when we first came out with the breaking news that they had been charged. As Ellis said, this thing may take months. He didn't know how many months, but they were still investigating. Again, you have the Minnesota Human Rights Department coming out and charging the Minnesota Police Department with civil rights violations in this case. And now they are investigating the Minnesota Police Department to find out if there have been civil rights violations in other cases. So, and you still have the Justice Department and the FBI doing their investigation into federal charges. So we'll just have to wait and see what other charges come down the pike, if there are any. But I just wanted to give y'all some information. So this way, because you can go to these criminal complaints, you can read them for yourself. You can see these medical examinations for yourself. Then you know you don't have to pay attention to all the bullshit and all of that these folks will throw out there at you. You don't have to pay attention to the bullshit the mainstream media might try to throw at you, because mainstream media might try to spin this a different kind of way, or mainstream media might try to only concentrate on what the Hennepin medical examiner said, instead of also putting in there what Michael Batten, the independent medical examiner, had to say. And actually, what he has to say, when you think about it, even if you're not a medical person, what he had to say and the cause of death that he listed makes a whole lot more sense. It makes a whole lot more sense, because we see this man going unconscious, and we know that it's a loss of blood to the brain that causes unconsciousness in this situation. And as we already talked about, in cases of asphyxiation, the first sign that you're in trouble is that unconscious. You know that unconsciousness is the first sign of trouble. And if you don't hurry up and get some blood flow to the brain, if you don't hurry up and get some good breaths and be able to breathe and all of that, you are going to die. It's just that simple. So yeah, y'all, that's it. I've got some more information coming to you about this whole coronavirus thing. We've got to find out what's going on with the Ahmaud Arbery case. We've also got to find out what's going on in the Breonna Taylor case. So there's a whole lot going on, and I'm going to do my best to keep you as well informed as I possibly can. If I give y'all any wrong information, please forgive me. And if you find out the right information, let me know. Let me know. Put a link in the comment section or whatever to let me know that I've given out the wrong information, because I don't want to do that. But just like there was this report going around a couple of 3-4 nights ago that George Zimmerman was arrested in Fulton County in Atlanta. He was arrested on a DUI charge, and we found out that that was false information, that was a fake story. So these fake stories are out there. So that's the reason why when I do research, that's the reason why I try my best to find stories on multiple sources. So, you know, that's the more sources that bring you a story, it kind of lends to give it more credibility and more validity. So, but this is just the information that I have right now. Please like this video. Please share this video. Please make sure that you are having these conversations. not just on social media, but that you are also having these conversations in your personal life, that you are talking to people, you are talking to friends, you are talking to family, you are talking to coworkers. Make sure you're having these conversations. Make sure you're having these conversations about police brutality. Make sure that if you are a part of the protest and you have or you intend to be a part of the protest, make sure that you are aware of what's going on out there in the street. Make sure that people know, family, friends know that you're out there, that you intend to be a part of this. Turn the GPS off on your phones. Make sure you know who's around you. Don't go out there by yourself or just 2 or 3 of you going out there. Go out there, with 5, 6, 7 deep. You understand what I'm saying? And keep track of each other. Stay with each other. And understand there are other forces out there on the street. There are white supremacist groups. There are non-blacks that are now committing violence against black people that are protesting. You got undercover police officers. You got the military out there in the form of the National Guard that you have to deal with. So just be aware and understand that just because they're carrying a sign that says Black Lives Matter or fuck the police or whatever, they are not a part of this protest. They are out there to push their own agendas. A lot of them are out there to incite violence. A lot of them are out there to commit violence. They're trying to push their own agenda. So please make sure that you're staying aware. You're not getting caught up in everything that's going on. But black folks, Foundation of Black Americans, period. Make sure that we keep this. We don't let anybody come in and hijack these protests. We don't let anybody come in and change the narrative. This is about police brutality, especially towards black folks. That's what this is about. This is not about any one specific person. This is not about specifically Ahmaud Arbery. This is not about specifically Breonna Taylor. This is not about specifically George Floyd. This is not about specifically Trayvon Martin. This is not about specifically Philando Castile. This is not about specifically Freddie Gray. This is about all of them as a collective. That's what this is about. This is about us being killed in the streets with impunity by not only police officers, but also by other white folks. So don't pay attention to all these coons you got coming out. You got Floyd, George Floyd's brother. He's done come out and jumped on the coon train with all of this peace and kumbaya and all of that mess and trying to act like this is just all about him and all of that. No, this is about us as a collective. You got the Atlanta mayor Keisha Bottoms coming out with all of this go home, go home. You got T.I. and Killer Mike coming out with all that bullshit. You got so many coons coming out with all of this, telling people that they need to stop and they need to go home and all of this. No, you need to protest. You need to protest. And you don't need to listen to these people. You don't need to listen to these people that are just concentrating on destruction and businesses that have been lost and all of this kind of stuff. Because these people are trying to shame you. These people are trying to make you feel bad. These folks are trying to make you stop what you're doing. Because they don't want what you're doing to have any kind of an impact. Tamika Mallory had some very, very good advice. And that advice was, if you are new to protesting, you don't know about protesting, you don't know about all of these different groups that come in and try to hijack protests. You understand what I'm saying? And try to change the direction and change the focus and change the course of protest. Like she said, get with organizations. Get with people who are organized. Get with people who know what protesting is really all about. And for goodness sakes, watch your backs. Watch your backs and the backs of other people around you, other black folks around you, the black folks that you went there with. Like I said, don't just go 1 or 2 or 3. Go 10, 12 deep and watch each other's backs. Because this is not brand new. This ain't something that just came up when they started with Antifa. And it's always been this way. There have always been people that were sent in on purpose to disrupt a protest. and to try to hijack protests and to try to change the course and the direction and the narrative of the protest. And black folks, we can't let them do that. And all this dancing and all of this foolishness is going on and all this hugging police officers and all of this kind of stuff that's going on. Y'all need to stop all of that. All of these soft spots, and we're going to be the softies, and we're going to be the ones with the big hearts and all that. That's what got us in this shape that we in now. That's the reason why every other group in America just completely runs over us and bulldozes us and pays us absolutely no attention and shows us absolutely no respect and has total disregard for our lives, our communities, totally disregard for us. Because we always want a hug. We always want acceptance. We always want to feel like we're being liked or we being loved. If you want to hug somebody, hug another black protester beside you. But all this hugging police officers and all this kind of stuff and carrying on with these police officers, stop that. Because that same police officer that hugged you today might kill you tomorrow. You or your family member or your friend or whatever. Because it has not been long enough. Nothing has changed yet. There has been no reform. There has been no change. There has been no transformation. So stop with all of these emotional moments, with all of this hugging and all this. These folks coming out with all this crying. Stop all of that. If you ain't hard enough, if you ain't tough enough, if you ain't ready enough to be out there, then come home and sit this one out. Until you are ready to do it the way Malcolm said it, by any means necessary. We have to take our freedom by any means necessary. We have to protect ourselves. We have to protect each other. We have to protect our community. And we have to do that by any means necessary. Remember your Second Amendment rights. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So please subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed. Please hit that bell notification so that you can be notified when we upload videos. But please make sure that you get in this description box and that if nothing else, you listen, you read these criminal complaints for yourself and you listen to what this doctor has to say. You listen to his breakdown and his explanation of the cause of death as far as George Floyd was concerned and as far as these two autopsies are concerned. Okay? So that's it for tonight, and I'll see you guys real soon.